The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets of downtown Detroit when Marcus Thompson first heard the screams echoing from the hospital district. He pressed his back against the cold brick wall of the pharmacy he'd been scavenging, his weathered hands gripping the baseball bat that had become his most trusted companion over the past 3 weeks since the outbreak began. The 42-year-old former construction foreman had learned to distinguish between different types of screams in this new world: the high-pitched terror of someone seeing the infected for the first time, the desperate calls for help from those still clinging to hope, and the gut-wrenching agony of someone being torn apart by what used to be their neighbors, friends, or family. These screams belonged to the latter category, and they were getting closer. Marcus glanced through the shattered window of Pete's Corner Pharmacy, where bottles of prescription medications lay scattered across the floor like confetti from Hell's own parade. He'd managed to gather enough antibiotics and painkillers to last his small group another 2 weeks, but medical supplies meant nothing if they couldn't stay alive long enough to use them. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by an ominous silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. In his experience, silence was often more dangerous than noise in this infected wasteland that America had become. 3 blocks away, Dr. Jennifer Walsh crouched behind an overturned ambulance, clutching a blood-stained medical bag while trying to calm the trembling teenage boy beside her. 17-year-old Tyler Rodriguez had a deep gash running down his left arm from when they'd barely escaped through a second-story window, and despite her years of emergency room experience, Jennifer found her hands shaking as she cleaned the wound. The 38-year-old physician had witnessed more death and horror in the past month than in her entire 15-year medical career, but what terrified her most wasn't the infected themselves, it was watching humanity's rapid descent into savagery as people fought over dwindling resources. Tyler winced as she applied antiseptic to his wound, his dark eyes constantly scanning the debris-filled street for any sign of movement. "Doc, we can't stay here much longer," he whispered, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "My sister Emma is waiting at the school with the others, and if those things find them..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what happened when the infected found hiding places. Meanwhile, in the basement of Jefferson Elementary School, a group of 12 survivors had barricaded themselves behind desks, chairs, and anything else they could find to reinforce the steel doors that separated them from the chaos outside. Emma Rodriguez, Tyler's 19-year-old sister, stood guard at the narrow basement window, her keen eyes watching for any movement in the playground where children used to laugh and play just weeks ago. The psychology student had appointed herself as the group's lookout, partly because of her sharp observation skills, but mostly because staying busy helped her avoid thinking about whether her little brother was still alive out there. Behind her, retired Marine Sergeant David Mitchell methodically cleaned and loaded the handful of weapons they'd managed to scavenge from the police station before it was overrun. At 61, David was the oldest member of their group, but his military training and unwavering determination had kept them alive when younger, stronger people had fallen to panic and despair. He'd seen combat in 3 different wars, but nothing had prepared him for fighting an enemy that felt no pain, showed no mercy, and seemed to multiply with every bite. The infected had appeared without warning on a Tuesday morning in late September, starting with isolated incidents in major metropolitan areas that quickly spiraled into a nationwide catastrophe. Government officials had initially downplayed the severity, calling it a localized outbreak of a new strain of rabies, but within 72 hours, every major city was reporting thousands of cases. The symptoms followed a horrifying pattern: high fever, aggressive behavior, loss of cognitive function, and an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Victims retained enough motor function to run, climb, and hunt in coordinated groups, but they lost all traces of their former humanity. Traditional weapons could stop them, but only through massive trauma to the brain or complete destruction of the central nervous system. Most disturbing of all, anyone bitten by an infected person would begin showing symptoms within 6 to 12 hours, creating an exponential spread that overwhelmed emergency services, military response teams, and evacuation efforts. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus made his way carefully through the maze of abandoned vehicles and debris toward the elementary school where he hoped to reunite with the group he'd been separated from during a supply run gone wrong. Every shadow could hide death, every sound might signal the approach of a pack of infected, and every step forward was a calculated risk that could mean the difference between finding his friends alive or becoming another casualty in America's fight for survival. The weight of the medical supplies in his backpack reminded him that he carried more than just his own life in his hands. Somewhere in that school, people were counting on him to return with the antibiotics needed to treat infections and wounds that would be death sentences in this new world. As he rounded the corner and saw the school's familiar red brick facade in the distance, Marcus Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle for humanity's future was just beginning, and the next 24 hours would determine whether his small group of survivors would live to see another sunrise in the wasteland that was once the United States of America. The infected struck without warning just as Marcus was crossing the final stretch of open ground toward Jefferson Elementary. A pack of 6 former humans burst from the wreckage of a school bus, their clothes torn and blood-stained, their eyes vacant yet somehow filled with predatory hunger. Marcus swung his baseball bat with practiced precision, connecting with the skull of the first infected with a sickening crack that echoed across the empty playground. The creature dropped instantly, but the others pressed forward with the relentless determination that made them so terrifying. They felt no pain, knew no fear, and would continue attacking until their bodies were too damaged to function. Marcus backpedaled toward a cluster of concrete picnic tables, using them as barriers while he fought off the remaining infected. Each swing of his bat required perfect timing and placement. A missed strike or poorly aimed blow would leave him vulnerable to the gnashing teeth and clawing fingers that had already claimed so many lives. Inside the school basement, Emma Rodriguez spotted the commotion through the narrow window and immediately alerted the others, her heart racing as she recognized the lone figure desperately fighting for his life in their makeshift sanctuary's front yard. David Mitchell reacted with the swift efficiency of a seasoned combat veteran, grabbing his rifle and moving toward the basement's emergency exit despite the protests of other survivors who feared opening any door to the outside world. "That man's got medical supplies," David announced grimly, having spotted the distinctive Red Cross marking on Marcus's backpack through Emma's whispered description. "If we don't help him now, we lose both the supplies and a potential ally, and we need both if we're going to survive another week in this hellhole." The former Marine had learned long ago that survival often required calculated risks, and leaving a well-equipped survivor to die outside their door was the kind of short-sighted decision that got entire units wiped out. Emma volunteered to accompany him, arguing that her brother Tyler would never forgive her if she let someone die without trying to help, especially when that someone might have information about Tyler's whereabouts. Against his better judgment, David agreed to let her come, but only after making her promise to follow his orders without question and retreat immediately if the situation became untenable. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had finally stabilized Tyler's wound when they heard the unmistakable sounds of combat echoing from the direction of the elementary school. The teenager's face went pale as he recognized the location of the fighting, and despite his injured arm, he insisted they move toward the school to check on his sister's safety. Jennifer understood his desperation. She'd lost her own family in the early days of the outbreak and knew the crushing weight of uncertainty about loved ones' fates. However, her medical training had taught her to assess risks carefully, and rushing toward the sounds of battle while carrying limited medical supplies and escorting an injured patient seemed like a prescription for disaster. "Tyler, we need to approach this strategically," she said while packing her medical bag with steady hands that belied her racing heart. "If your sister is in that school, the best way to help her is to arrive alive and capable of providing assistance, not to get ourselves killed or infected trying to be heroes." The young man's jaw tightened with frustration, but he recognized the wisdom in her words and reluctantly agreed to follow her lead as they began moving cautiously through the maze of abandoned cars and debris toward the elementary school. The battle in the playground intensified as more infected emerged from various hiding places throughout the neighborhood, drawn by the noise and the scent of living humans. Marcus found himself surrounded, his breathing becoming labored as he fought off wave after wave of former citizens who had once lived normal lives in this very community. A middle-aged woman in a tattered nurse's uniform lunged at him with outstretched fingers, her wedding ring catching the afternoon sunlight as she tried to claw his face. Marcus dodged her attack and brought his bat down on her skull, trying not to think about the family she might have had or the patients she had once tried to heal. This was the psychological toll that wore down survivors almost as much as the physical exhaustion. Every infected they killed had once been someone's parent, child, spouse, or friend, and each necessary act of violence chipped away at their humanity piece by piece. The infected felt no such moral burden. They operated on pure instinct, making them both predictable and terrifyingly efficient in their singular purpose of feeding on the living. David and Emma burst through the school's emergency exit just as Marcus was beginning to falter under the relentless assault. The retired Marine's first shot took down an infected man in a business suit who was approaching Marcus from behind, while Emma used a crowbar to trip another creature that was closing in from the left side. "This way!" David shouted over the groans and snarls of the remaining infected, laying down covering fire as Marcus sprinted toward the school building. The three survivors fought their way back toward the emergency exit, with David's military experience proving invaluable in coordinating their retreat while Emma's quick thinking helped them avoid being cornered against the building's brick wall. As they reached the relative safety of the school's interior, Marcus gasped out his thanks while David immediately began securing the door they'd just passed through. The medical supplies were safe, the group had gained a valuable new member, and for the moment, they had successfully defended their temporary sanctuary, but all three survivors knew that the sounds of their battle had likely attracted every infected creature within a 2-mile radius, making their current location far more dangerous than it had been just 30 minutes earlier. The sound of groaning and shuffling feet outside the school grew steadily louder as more infected converged on their location, drawn by the gunfire and commotion from the playground battle. David Mitchell positioned himself at the narrow basement window, counting at least 20 figures stumbling across the school grounds in the fading afternoon light, their movements creating an eerie choreography of decay and hunger. "We've got company coming from all directions," he announced to the group while checking his ammunition supply with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned that running out of bullets at the wrong moment meant certain death. Marcus Thompson slumped against the basement wall, his chest heaving from exertion and adrenaline, but his eyes remained alert as he surveyed their makeshift fortress and the anxious faces of the 12 people who had been waiting for his return. Among them was Patricia Williams, a 45-year-old high school science teacher who had become the group's unofficial leader in David's absence, her classroom management skills proving surprisingly useful for organizing survivors and maintaining morale during the darkest moments. Beside her stood Robert Chen, a 28-year-old EMT whose medical training complemented Dr. Walsh's expertise, though they had yet to reunite since the chaos of the initial outbreak had scattered their original group across the city. Emma Rodriguez pressed her face against the basement window, scanning the growing crowd of infected for any sign of her brother Tyler, when she spotted two figures moving carefully between the abandoned cars in the school parking lot. "Someone's out there," she whispered urgently, pointing toward the area where Dr. Walsh and Tyler were making their cautious approach toward the building. David immediately recognized the tactical problem they faced. Opening any door to let the newcomers inside would potentially expose the entire group to the infected mob that was steadily surrounding the school, but leaving potential survivors outside went against every moral principle that separated them from the monsters prowling the streets. "Robert, get your medical kit ready," David ordered the young EMT, recognizing that anyone still alive outside had likely sustained injuries getting this far. "Patricia, I need you to coordinate moving everyone to the far end of the basement in case we need to fall back to the emergency tunnel that leads to the old boiler room." The science teacher nodded grimly, understanding that their carefully planned defensive position was about to be tested in ways they had hoped to avoid. Dr. Jennifer Walsh crouched behind a overturned maintenance cart with Tyler, watching the infected slowly shamble around the school's perimeter while trying to identify potential entry points that wouldn't lead them directly into the growing crowd of creatures. Her medical bag contained enough supplies to treat serious injuries for several people, but getting inside the building alive required timing their approach perfectly to avoid detection by the infected who seemed to be following some sort of primitive pack behavior. Tyler's injured arm was throbbing with each heartbeat, but his determination to reach his sister gave him strength to ignore the pain as he studied the school building where they had both attended classes just a few years earlier. "There's a window well on the east side that leads directly to the basement," he whispered to Dr. Walsh, remembering how he and his friends used to sneak into the school after hours to use the gymnasium. "If we can reach it without being seen, we might be able to get inside without alerting the main group of infected." The plan was risky, requiring them to cross 30 yards of open ground while carrying medical supplies and dealing with Tyler's limited mobility, but it seemed like their best option as more infected continued to arrive from neighboring streets. Inside the basement, Marcus distributed the medical supplies he'd risked his life to obtain, his hands steady despite the chaos brewing outside their temporary sanctuary. The antibiotics would help prevent infections in the numerous cuts and scrapes that were inevitable in this new world, while the painkillers would allow injured survivors to remain functional during the physical demands of constant flight and combat. "We need to start thinking about our next move," Marcus told the group while organizing the medications by type and dosage. This location was supposed to be temporary, and with this many infected gathering outside, we're going to be trapped here unless we can create a distraction or find another way out. Patricia Williams had been considering the same problem, using her knowledge of the school's layout to identify potential escape routes that didn't involve fighting through dozens of infected creatures. The old building had several emergency exits, but most led directly to areas that were now crawling with former neighbors and community members who had been transformed into relentless predators. The situation grew more desperate as Tyler and Dr. Walsh made their move toward the window well, timing their sprint to coincide with a moment when most of the infected were facing away from their position. Tyler's injured arm slowed him down more than expected, and halfway across the open ground, an infected child of perhaps 10 years old spotted them and released a bone-chilling shriek that immediately attracted the attention of every creature within hearing distance. Dr. Walsh grabbed Tyler's good arm and pulled him toward the window well as fast as his injuries would allow, while behind them, the infected began moving with the disturbing coordination that made them so deadly when hunting in groups. Inside the basement, Emma heard her brother's voice calling out in pain and terror, and despite David's shouted orders to stay back, she rushed toward the window well to help guide them to safety, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether their small group of survivors would be reunited or torn apart by the growing horde that now completely surrounded Jefferson Elementary School. The infected child's shriek triggered a domino effect as every creature in the vicinity turned toward Tyler and Dr. Walsh, their vacant eyes suddenly focused with predatory intensity on the two living humans struggling toward the basement window well. Emma Rodriguez threw caution to the wind, pushing open the narrow basement window and extending her arms to help pull her injured brother to safety, while David Mitchell provided covering fire from his position near the emergency exit, his rifle shots echoing through the concrete corridors of the school basement. Dr. Jennifer Walsh shoved Tyler toward his sister's outstretched hands, her medical training kicking in as she assessed his rapidly deteriorating condition. The sprint across open ground had reopened his arm wound, and blood was now soaking through the makeshift bandage she'd applied earlier. "Get him inside now," she shouted over the growing chorus of groans and snarls as the infected began converging on their position with frightening speed. Marcus Thompson and Robert Chen rushed to assist with the rescue, grabbing Tyler's shoulders and hauling him through the window well while Emma and Dr. Walsh squeezed through the narrow opening just seconds before the first infected creatures reached their position. The sound of clawing fingers and gnashing teeth against the basement windows created a horrifying symphony that sent chills down the spines of even the most hardened survivors in their group. Patricia Williams immediately took charge of the situation, directing Robert Chen to help Dr. Walsh treat Tyler's reopened wound while David maintained his position covering the basement's multiple entry points. The science teacher's organizational skills proved invaluable as she coordinated the group's response to their rapidly deteriorating situation. They now had 13 people crowded into a basement that was surrounded by an estimated 30 to 40 infected creatures, with limited ammunition, dwindling food supplies, and no clear escape route that wouldn't require fighting through overwhelming numbers of the undead. "We need to create a diversion," Patricia announced after quickly assessing their tactical position and available resources. "If we can draw most of the infected away from the building, a small group might be able to escape through the boiler room tunnel and reach the vehicles we spotted parked behind the grocery store 3 blocks away." The plan was desperate and dangerous, requiring some members of the group to sacrifice their safety for the chance that others might survive, but it represented their best hope for avoiding the slow death of being trapped in an underground tomb while the infected waited patiently above. Dr. Walsh worked frantically to stabilize Tyler's condition while Emma held her brother's hand, whispering reassurances that neither of them truly believed as the sounds of the infected grew louder and more persistent outside their basement refuge. The young man had lost more blood than initially apparent, and his skin was taking on the pale, clammy appearance that Dr. Walsh recognized as early signs of shock setting in from blood loss and exhaustion. "I need to get him to a proper medical facility," she told Emma quietly, though they both knew that hospitals had been among the first institutions to fall when the outbreak began, overrun by infected patients who had turned on medical staff and other patients in confined spaces that became death traps. Robert Chen assisted with the medical treatment, his EMT training complementing Dr. Walsh's expertise as they worked to prevent Tyler's condition from becoming life-threatening, but both medical professionals understood that their current environment was far from ideal for treating serious injuries or preventing infections that could prove fatal without proper antibiotics and surgical equipment. Marcus Thompson studied the basement's layout with the eye of someone who had spent years working construction, noting structural details that might provide alternatives to the obvious escape routes that would lead them directly into the waiting arms of the infected horde. The building's foundation was solid concrete, but there were utility access points and maintenance tunnels that might offer passage to adjacent buildings or sewer systems that could provide concealed movement through the neighborhood. "There's an old steam tunnel that connects this building to the municipal building 2 blocks south," Marcus informed the group, recalling blueprints he'd worked with during a renovation project several years earlier. "If we can access it through the boiler room, we might be able to move underground without alerting the infected to our location." The tunnel would be narrow, dark, and potentially dangerous, but it represented a chance to escape their current predicament without engaging in a firefight they were unlikely to survive given their limited ammunition and the overwhelming numbers they faced. The debate over their escape strategy was interrupted by a new sound that sent ice through their veins, the methodical pounding of infected fists against the basement's main door, accompanied by the splintering of wood that suggested their barricade was beginning to fail under the relentless assault. David Mitchell checked his rifle's magazine and grimly announced that he had perhaps 20 rounds remaining, while the other armed survivors reported similarly low ammunition counts that would be exhausted within minutes if they attempted to fight their way out through conventional means. "We move now or we don't move at all," David declared, his military experience telling him that hesitation in desperate situations was often more deadly than bold action, even when that action carried significant risks. Patricia Williams began organizing the group for movement through the boiler room tunnel, while Dr. Walsh and Robert Chen prepared Tyler for transport despite his weakened condition, knowing that leaving him behind was not an option any of them could live with, even if carrying an injured person through narrow underground passages would slow their escape and increase the danger for everyone involved in their desperate flight from Jefferson Elementary School and the growing army of infected that had turned their temporary sanctuary into a potential tomb. The splintering of wood grew louder as the infected finally broke through the outer barricade, their decomposing hands clawing at the steel door that now represented the only barrier between the survivors and certain death. David Mitchell took point position as the group began their desperate crawl through the narrow maintenance tunnel that Marcus had discovered behind the boiler room, his rifle ready despite knowing that firing in the confined space would likely deafen them all and potentially cause a cave-in that would trap them underground permanently. Dr. Walsh and Robert Chen carefully maneuvered Tyler through the cramped passage, his semi-conscious state making him dead weight that slowed their progress considerably while the sounds of metal bending and concrete cracking echoed behind them from the basement they'd just abandoned. Emma Rodriguez crawled directly behind her brother, one hand maintaining contact with his leg to monitor his condition while the other gripped a flashlight that provided their only illumination in the pitch-black tunnel system that smelled of rust, decay, and decades of accumulated moisture. The tunnel was barely wide enough for adults to crawl through single file, with sharp metal edges and protruding pipes that caught clothing and scraped exposed skin as they inched their way toward what they hoped would be freedom rather than another death trap in the underground maze beneath the city. Patricia Williams maintained her position in the middle of the group, calling out warnings about obstacles and coordinating their movement through the treacherous passage while Marcus brought up the rear, pausing periodically to listen for sounds of pursuit that would indicate the infected had discovered their escape route. The science teacher's calm voice and methodical approach helped prevent panic among the 13 survivors who were now completely dependent on a construction worker's memory of building plans that might be outdated or inaccurate, crawling through darkness toward an uncertain destination while the infected potentially flooded the basement they just evacuated. Behind them, the sounds of destruction grew fainter but more ominous, suggesting that the creatures had indeed broken through their defenses and were now exploring the abandoned basement with the methodical persistence that made them such effective hunters. The group's progress slowed further when Tyler began showing signs of fever, his body temperature rising rapidly in a way that made both Dr. Walsh and Robert Chen exchange worried glances in the dim flashlight beam, though neither medical professional voiced their growing concern that the young man might be developing an infection that could prove fatal without proper treatment. The tunnel system proved more complex than Marcus had anticipated, with multiple branching passages that led to different buildings throughout the downtown district, requiring split-second decisions about which route would lead them to safety rather than into another basement filled with infected creatures who had been trapped underground since the outbreak began. Left tunnel leads to the municipal building, right leads to the old library, Marcus whispered, consulting a mental map that was based on construction projects from several years earlier and might not account for modifications or blockages that could have occurred since then. David Mitchell made the tactical decision to split their group temporarily, sending Patricia Williams with 5 survivors down the left tunnel while he led the remaining members toward the library, reasoning that smaller groups would move faster and be less likely to attract attention if they encountered infected creatures in the underground passages. Dr. Walsh insisted on staying with Tyler despite the increased danger, while Emma refused to leave her brother's side regardless of the medical team's recommendations, creating a smaller group that was slowed by an injured member but united by family bonds that had proven stronger than the fear of death that stalked them through the darkness. The library tunnel opened into a sub-basement that had been converted into storage space decades earlier, filled with old books, outdated equipment, and the musty smell of paper slowly decomposing in the humid underground environment. David's military training helped him navigate the cluttered space efficiently, identifying potential threats and escape routes while Dr. Walsh assessed Tyler's deteriorating condition in the better lighting provided by emergency fixtures that still functioned despite the power grid failures that had affected most of the city. Tyler's fever was spiking dangerously high, and the infection around his arm wound was spreading faster than antibiotics could control, presenting Dr. Walsh with the horrifying possibility that they had risked everything to save someone who might not survive the next few hours regardless of their medical intervention. Robert Chen worked alongside her to stabilize Tyler's condition using the limited supplies they'd managed to carry through the tunnel system, but both medical professionals understood that without access to a proper surgical facility and stronger antibiotics, their patients' chances of survival were diminishing rapidly even as they fought to reach safety above ground. Emma Rodriguez refused to accept the possibility that her brother might not survive their escape, her determination providing emotional strength for the entire group as they prepared to emerge from the library's basement into a world that had been fundamentally transformed by the infected plague sweeping across America. Marcus Thompson scouted the stairwell leading to the main floor, moving with the cautious precision of someone who had learned that careless noise could attract dozens of infected creatures within minutes, while David covered their advance with his rifle and the last of their ammunition. The library's main floor appeared deserted, with overturned shelves and scattered books creating an obstacle course that would require careful navigation to reach the exit doors that represented their gateway to potential vehicle access and medical facilities that might still be operational in the less affected areas outside the city center. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of the basement storage area, each survivor understood that the next phase of their journey would test their resolve, their resources, and their ability to function as a cohesive unit in a world where human civilization was rapidly crumbling under the relentless assault of an enemy that felt no pain, showed no mercy, and would never stop hunting the living until every last person had been consumed or converted into another mindless predator stalking the ruins of what had once been the United States of America. The main floor of the Riverside Public Library had become a monument to the collapse of civilization, with toppled bookcases creating a maze of paper and debris that crunched underfoot as David Mitchell led the survivors through the once peaceful sanctuary of knowledge that now reeked of decay and abandonment. Shafts of late-afternoon sunlight streamed through broken windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above pools of dried blood where librarians and patrons had met their fate during the initial chaos of the outbreak, their final moments preserved in the scattered pages of books they would never finish reading. Emma Rodriguez struggled to support her brother Tyler, whose fever had reached dangerous levels that left him delirious and barely conscious, mumbling incoherently about childhood memories and family gatherings that seemed like distant dreams from another lifetime when America still existed as a functioning society rather than a wasteland prowling with hungry corpses. Dr. Walsh monitored Tyler's pulse with growing alarm, recognizing the symptoms of septic shock that could prove fatal within hours without immediate intervention, while Robert Chen carried the medical supplies that represented their only hope of keeping the young man alive long enough to reach a facility where his condition might be stabilized. Marcus Thompson brought up the rear guard, his baseball bat ready as he watched for movement among the shadows cast by overturned furniture and collapsed ceiling tiles that had created hiding places where infected creatures could lurk unseen until unsuspecting survivors passed within striking distance. The group's careful progress through the library was interrupted by a low growling sound that seemed to emanate from the children's section, where colorful book displays had been transformed into bloody crime scenes that told the horrific story of families who had sought shelter in what they believed would be a safe haven from the chaos consuming their city. David immediately signaled for silence, his military instincts recognizing the distinctive vocalization that indicated an infected creature was feeding, which meant they were dealing with a recently turned individual who still retained enough motor function to be extremely dangerous in close-quarters combat. Through gaps in the fallen bookcases, they could see a figure hunched over something on the floor near the picture book area, its movements suggesting the mechanical efficiency of a predator that had successfully cornered prey, though whether the victim was already dead or still clinging to life was impossible to determine from their current position. Dr. Walsh exchanged worried glances with Robert Chen, both medical professionals understanding that any delay in their escape could prove fatal for Tyler, whose condition was deteriorating rapidly despite their best efforts to maintain his body temperature and blood pressure using the limited resources available in their emergency medical kit. Emma's grip tightened on her brother's arm as they navigated around a collapsed reference desk, her heart breaking as she watched Tyler struggle with fever-induced hallucinations that made him call out for their parents, who had been among the first casualties when the outbreak reached their neighborhood 3 weeks earlier. The young woman had assumed responsibility for her brother's survival with the fierce determination of someone who had already lost everything else that mattered, and she refused to accept that his injuries might prove fatal despite the obvious signs that his body was losing the battle against infection and blood loss. Marcus whispered urgent instructions about maintaining noise discipline as they approached the library's main entrance, where floor-to-ceiling windows provided a clear view of the street beyond and the vehicles they desperately needed to reach, but also exposed them to potential observation by infected creatures that might be roaming the downtown area in search of living prey. The sight of an intact pickup truck parked across the street filled the survivors with hope, though reaching it would require crossing 30 yards of open ground while carrying an injured person who could no longer support his own weight. David Mitchell assessed their tactical situation with the cold calculation of a combat veteran who had learned that emotional decisions often led to casualties that could have been avoided through careful planning and disciplined execution. The infected creature in the children's section appeared to be alone, but engaging it in combat would create noise that could attract others from throughout the building or surrounding area, while attempting to sneak past carried the risk of discovery that could result in a running battle they were unlikely to survive given their limited ammunition and Tyler's inability to move quickly. "We need a distraction," David murmured to Marcus, who nodded his understanding and began searching through the debris for objects that could be thrown to create noise in a different part of the building, drawing the infected away from their planned escape route. The construction worker found several hardcover books that would make sufficient noise when thrown against metal shelving, though timing the distraction would require precise coordination to ensure the infected moved far enough away to allow safe passage through the main entrance. Dr. Walsh administered another dose of antibiotics to Tyler while they waited for David and Marcus to execute their distraction plan, her medical training warring with maternal instincts as she watched a young man's life ebbing away despite her best efforts to save him. Robert Chen prepared emergency stimulants that might temporarily boost Tyler's blood pressure and consciousness, though both medical professionals understood that such measures were desperate attempts to buy time rather than genuine treatments for the septic shock that was shutting down his vital organs. The weight of responsibility pressed down on every member of the group as they prepared for what might be their final sprint to freedom, each survivor understanding that the decisions made in the next few minutes would determine whether their weeks of struggle and sacrifice had meaning. or whether they would join the countless victims whose remains littered the streets of a country that had once been the beacon of hope for the entire world but now served as a cautionary tale about humanity's fragility when faced with an enemy that turned civilization's greatest strengths into weaknesses, that accelerated society's collapse into chaos, fear, and the primitive struggle for survival that had consumed what remained of the United States of America. Marcus Thompson hurled a thick encyclopedia toward the far end of the library, the heavy book crashing into a metal cart with a resounding clang that immediately drew the infected creature away from the children's section, its head snapping toward the sound with predatory alertness before shambling in that direction with the mechanical persistence that made these creatures so terrifyingly effective at hunting living prey. David Mitchell counted to 10 before signaling the group to move, his military training dictating precise timing that would maximize their window of opportunity while minimizing exposure to detection by other infected that might be lurking in the surrounding buildings or side streets. Dr. Walsh and Robert Chen lifted Tyler between them, the young man's dead weight making their movement awkward and slow as they navigated through the maze of fallen books and debris toward the library's main entrance, while Emma Rodriguez maintained her position beside her brother, whispering encouragement that he was too delirious to understand but that helped maintain her own emotional stability during their desperate escape attempt. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty street as they approached the glass doors that separated them from the final sprint to the pickup truck, and through the transparent barrier, they could see the vehicle that represented their salvation sitting tantalizingly close yet still dangerously far from their current position. The street appeared deserted, but David's combat experience had taught him that appearances could be fatally deceiving, especially when dealing with an enemy that could remain motionless for hours before exploding into sudden, violent action when living humans came within striking distance. He studied the parked cars, doorways, and alley entrances that could conceal infected creatures waiting in ambush, while Marcus examined the pickup truck through binoculars scavenged from the library's reference desk, confirming that the vehicle appeared intact and potentially functional despite weeks of abandonment in the infected wasteland that downtown had become. Keys might still be inside, Marcus whispered hopefully, though they all understood that hot wiring the vehicle was a possibility if necessary, assuming they could reach it alive and gain enough time to start the engine before being overwhelmed by any infected that their movement might attract. Tyler's breathing became increasingly labored as his body fought the losing battle against septic shock, his skin taking on the gray pallor that Dr. Walsh recognized as a sign that his circulatory system was beginning to shut down despite their best efforts to maintain his blood pressure using the limited medical interventions available in their emergency kit. Emma Rodriguez made a decision that shocked everyone in the group, announcing quietly but firmly that she would create a diversion by running in the opposite direction to draw any nearby infected away from the truck while the others got Tyler to safety and medical treatment. "My brother needs that vehicle more than I do," she stated with the calm determination of someone who had already lost most of what mattered to her and was prepared to sacrifice everything else for the slim chance that Tyler might survive their ordeal. Dr. Walsh immediately protested the plan, arguing that splitting their group further would only increase casualties and reduce their overall chances of survival, but Emma had inherited the stubborn streak that ran in the Rodriguez family, and her mind was made up regardless of the logical arguments presented by the medical professional who had risked her own life to help strangers. David Mitchell understood the tactical value of Emma's proposal, though his military conscience rebelled against the idea of deliberately sending a civilian into danger to save others, especially when that civilian was barely out of her teens and had already endured trauma that would have broken many adult survivors. The debate was resolved when Tyler briefly regained consciousness, his fever-glazed eyes focusing with tremendous effort on his sister's face as he struggled to speak through lips cracked from dehydration and the physiological stress of fighting a systemic infection that was overwhelming his young body's defenses. "Emma, stay with the group," he whispered with what might have been his final coherent words, his hand squeezing hers with surprising strength for someone whose vital signs were rapidly deteriorating. "Promise me you'll survive this, even if I don't make it to wherever we're going." The exchange between siblings carried the weight of a final goodbye, though Emma refused to accept that possibility and instead focused on the immediate challenge of getting everyone to the pickup truck before Tyler's condition became irreversible. Robert Chen had been monitoring Tyler's pulse and blood pressure, and his grim expression told Dr. Walsh everything she needed to know about their patient's chances of surviving another hour without access to intensive medical intervention that simply wasn't available in their current circumstances. Marcus Thompson took point position as they prepared to exit the library, his construction worker's knowledge of urban environments helping him identify the fastest route to the pickup truck while avoiding obvious choke points where they could be trapped if infected creatures emerged from multiple directions simultaneously. The plan was simple but dangerous. David would provide rear-guard security while Dr. Walsh and Robert Chen carried Tyler, with Emma maintaining close support and Marcus leading them directly to the vehicle using whatever cover was available from parked cars and debris scattered throughout the street. As they pushed through the library's main doors, the late afternoon heat hit them like a physical blow, carrying with it the stench of decomposition and smoke from fires that had burned unchecked throughout the city since emergency services collapsed during the initial outbreak. The pickup truck seemed both impossibly close and infinitely far away as they began their final sprint across the open ground, each step forward bringing them closer to potential salvation while simultaneously exposing them to greater danger from infected creatures that might be drawn by their movement, their scent, or simply the primitive hunger that drove these former humans to hunt relentlessly through the ruins of American civilization until every last living person had been consumed or converted into another mindless predator stalking the wasteland that stretched from coast to coast across what had once been the most powerful nation on Earth. The sprint across the street became a nightmare of exposed vulnerability as Marcus Thompson led the group in a zigzag pattern between abandoned vehicles, his eyes constantly scanning for movement while the others struggled to carry Tyler Rodriguez, whose unconscious form had become completely limp as his body surrendered to the septic shock that was shutting down his vital organs one by one. Dr. Jennifer Walsh could feel his pulse growing weaker with each passing second, the medical professional in her recognizing the signs of impending cardiac arrest even as the survivor in her focused on reaching the pickup truck that represented their only chance of escaping the infected wasteland that downtown had become. Emma Rodriguez ran alongside her brother's makeshift stretcher, tears streaming down her face as she watched Tyler's skin take on the waxy appearance that preceded death, her whispered prayers mixing with Robert Chen's urgent medical instructions as they navigated around a cluster of burned-out cars that had been abandoned during the initial panic of the outbreak. Behind them, David Mitchell maintained his rearguard position with military precision, his rifle trained on the library entrance where the infected creature they had distracted was beginning to emerge, drawn by the sounds of their movement across the debris-littered asphalt. The pickup truck's driver's side door stood slightly ajar, and Marcus's heart soared when he spotted keys dangling from the ignition, left behind by some long-dead citizen who had probably been torn apart by infected creatures before they could complete their own escape attempt 3 weeks earlier. He yanked the door open and turned the key, the engine coughing to life with a rumble that seemed impossibly loud in the deadly silence that had settled over the abandoned city, but the sound of mechanical power filled the survivors with hope that had been in desperately short supply during their weeks of running and hiding from an enemy that never tired, never gave up, and never showed mercy to the living. Dr. Walsh and Robert Chen lifted Tyler into the truck's bed while Emma climbed in beside him, her hands immediately going to work checking his vital signs even though her basic first aid training was inadequate for treating the massive systemic infection that was killing her brother despite their heroic efforts to save him. David Mitchell backed toward the vehicle while maintaining his watch on the surrounding area, where shadows and debris could conceal dozens of infected creatures that might emerge without warning to overwhelm their small group just moments before they achieved the safety that had eluded them for so long. The truck lurched into motion as Marcus threw it into gear, but their escape was immediately complicated by the appearance of infected creatures emerging from storefronts and alleyways throughout the downtown district, drawn by the engine noise and the scent of living humans who had dared to venture into territory that the undead had claimed as their hunting ground. David's rifle cracked repeatedly as he fired through the truck's rear window, his shots carefully aimed to disable the fastest infected that were attempting to catch their accelerating vehicle, while Emma cradled her brother's head in her lap and felt his breathing become increasingly shallow and irregular. Dr. Walsh worked frantically to maintain Tyler's airway and blood pressure using emergency techniques that were designed to sustain life during transport to proper medical facilities, but she knew that without access to blood transfusions, surgical intervention, and powerful antibiotics, the young man's chances of survival were measured in minutes rather than hours. Robert Chen assisted with the medical emergency while also helping David watch for infected creatures that might be following their vehicle or setting up ambushes along the escape routes leading out of the city center. Marcus navigated through the maze of abandoned vehicles and debris with the skill of someone who had spent years driving construction equipment through difficult terrain, but even his expertise was tested by streets that had been transformed into obstacle courses by weeks of chaos, panic, and the complete breakdown of municipal services that had once maintained order in American cities. The truck's radio crackled with static interrupted by occasional transmissions from other survivor groups scattered throughout the region, their desperate calls for help and medical assistance painting a grim picture of a nation under siege by an enemy that had turned America's population density into a weapon that accelerated the collapse of everything that had once made the country a beacon of hope and opportunity for the entire world. Emma refused to give up on her brother even as his pulse became thready and his skin grew cold to the touch, her voice breaking as she begged him to keep fighting, to stay with her just a little longer, to hold on until they could reach one of the rumored safe zones that military broadcasts claimed were being established in rural areas where the infected were less concentrated and easier to contain. As they reached the outskirts of the city, Dr. Walsh made the heartbreaking decision to tell Emma what she had known for the past 20 minutes but had been unable to voice. Tyler's condition had deteriorated beyond the point where their limited medical resources could save him, and the best they could do was ensure his final moments were as comfortable as possible surrounded by people who cared about him. The truck rolled to a stop beside an abandoned gas station where Marcus had spotted a hand-painted sign advertising, "Sanctuary 50 miles," with an arrow pointing west toward rural farmland that might offer the safety and medical facilities their group desperately needed. Emma held her brother's hand as his breathing stopped, his young life ending not from the infected bite that had started their ordeal, but from the secondary infection that had proven just as deadly as the creatures stalking the ruins of American civilization, leaving behind a sister who would carry his memory forward into whatever uncertain future awaited the survivors of humanity's greatest crisis since the dawn of recorded history, their small group of 13 now reduced to 12 as they prepared to continue their journey toward hope, healing, and the possibility that somewhere in the devastated landscape of their homeland, other Americans were fighting back against the darkness that threatened to consume everything they had once held dear.